basic fall of the Bruning government, that the propaganda machine was so ripe and in fact was already functioning. Do you think that could account for the National Socialists' amazing election results that they experienced that particular year?
I'm really inclined to defer this to either my colleague Steve Watrous, who's a specialist in Russian and German, or to John, because I'm not either of those. And I think, you know, to analyze the degree to which Goebbels did not make but simply utilized, effectively utilized the pre-existing conditions within his culture. I'm inclined to say yes, but it's not upon a deep understanding of German history. Okay.
Thank you.
Steve, would you like to come here instead of being a...
I think he's where he wants to be. You know, and part of the reason for doing the lecture the way I did it last week was to emphasize that it's not Germany in 1933 that we're talking about. It's something much broader than that. And sure, it's done better, if you will, in Germany. But it's done elsewhere.
They don't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's done better in Germany, but it's done elsewhere.
When you say being done, you mean currently, or it was done?
No, it was done. I mean, there's no question that as a political machine, Nazi Germany was, you know, several steps above fascist Italy or any of the other fascist states. It's a more effective machine. It got rid of the contrary aspects of its culture, or submersed them more effectively than did other fascist regimes.
German militarism might account for that one.
Remember, right at the beginning of my lecture, I said I have a strain of Germanophobia. It's the wrong person to ask about that. Okay?
Speak louder.
I'm sorry.
We can't hear it all.
I'm sorry. I said at the beginning of my lecture last week, I mentioned that I have a strain of Germanophobia, and Mark had asked me whether you could attribute at least part of the problem to German militarism, which obviously extends back, or is perceived to extend back far, you know, before Nazi Germany. And I said, my answer was, as somebody who suffers from some Germanophobia, I'm really the wrong person to ask. I'm inclined to say yes, but that's a phobia. That's an irrational distrust of things German.
Well, I was just saying that in towards why Germany was so successful with fascism as opposed to Italy and other countries, because they had a long tradition of militaristic thought and belief. They put it in grandeur.
One of the exits provided for the success of German National Socialism is the Prussian tradition, is the greater strength of a certain kind of romanticism within Germany than elsewhere. And I obviously accept parts of that interpretation.
The Holy Roman Empire.
I'm not sure I can go back that far.
I would add to that, I think that the fact that the Germans had a more significant industrial base and a much more tightly organized infrastructure made anything that you were doing much more practical. In other words, you had the wherewithal to be effective. I don't want to play on stereotypes about the Italians making the trains run on time under Mussolini, but the reality was that the Germans were a far greater power even after the peace than the Italians were. Truncated as the economy was, it was still much more greater than the Italians were, and the Spanish. What were the Spanish? The Spanish are still struggling with industrialization. What could they do?
So the Spanish, they were pretty much supplied by Italy and Germany. And Germany, though, they were limited to what they could produce as far as, you know, the treaty went.
I'll pick up on something though, Rich, is that we're going to pursue that line of our problem, because what struck me in preparing for that lecture last week is that in every Middle European state, the rise of anti-Semitism, which is dated at around the turn of the century, it coincides, or is attributed to coincide with two things. First of all, the nationalist anti-Semitism of Russia and the subsequent migration of peoples into Middle Europe, and simultaneously the stirrings of the Industrial Revolution, the incipient stages of industrialism in Middle Europe. And yet in Germany, you're not talking about incipient industrialism. You're talking about a fully emergent, modern Rostovian third stage capitalist state. So it's a situation.
Genocide directed at the gypsies, because that's not mentioned in the Bible. And that's only a partial explanation, just like German militarism might be just a partial explanation. Otherwise, that Holocaust would stand out as the only Holocaust that existed in any time. It wouldn't explain things that happen currently or happened previously since then.
You know, as a historian, I'm not going to swallow a monocausal explanation of anything, including that. Fuzzy.
Okay.
But if you want to date, essentially the middle 18th. Let's say the 18th through the first half of the 19th. And after that, we begin to move into something different.
Dennis, I'd like to take on some of the points you raised last week and maybe stimulate some discussion that way. One from a kind of a theoretical perspective and one from a historical perspective. The picture that you portrayed in terms of human groupings, to me, strikes me as, you know, this in-group, out-group, and self-definition is a kind of anthropology that was current around the end of the 19th century in terms of understanding human processes, but differences. I can think of whole regions in Central Africa and West Africa where you get kind of like a checkered effect of different groups living one right next to another. The sense I got out of your lecture was that almost there's inevitability in the human condition that basically one side is going to stereotype the other side, and should the right conditions come along, push them over the brink. And that doesn't offer me much hope, as well as it to fit with the facts. The other thing, which is that you said, well Sandy Lowe didn't...
Can we take one at a time?
Okay, do that one first.
It helps. Particularly when you're dealing in a field which is not a field of my expertise. Let's start with the disclaimer I began with last week. I am not a cultural anthropologist, nor am I a social psychologist. What I was relying upon were works, most of which were written in the 70s and early 80s, and probably reflect the state of scholarship of the 60s and late 70s, because that's the location. And for that, I'll claim guilt. What they all say is not that you have to end up with a we-ness-they-ness that results in institutional segregation or terror or extermination, but rather that
has to be maintained at a high level to ensure group survivability, and that there is a connection between that group survivability and that group singly being within inside its own particular land space, that it's coterminous with the land space. And I'm saying is that we have lots of examples around the world where that's not true.
No, I wouldn't touch land at all.
And the reason is that that you had a history. It was kind of a slip last week. It was kind of Jews living throughout Europe ever since before Christ. If the dates in Italy are right, isn't it about 4th century BC that Jews started coming up through Sicily? And yet there isn't a recognition that these people are Europeans in the same way that anybody else is, even in the way you formulated your things. The Jews is distinct from Europeans. The Jews is distinct from any other group there. The Jews were as European by that time as any other who came in through the period after the time that they came in. it's a very subtle point, but I think it's a really crucial point that there was a non-recognition by large numbers of people of the basic facts of history, that the Jews had been there as long as anybody else had been there and had claimed to be in those areas.
And longer than some.
Okay. The second point I thought was interesting that you said was that, well, what if Sandy Lowe was right to kick the Jews out earlier? And they did. They did in England, they did in Spain, they did in a whole variety of other countries. So that
That's not
it
what
was
I
a
said.
question in terms of circumstances. Well, that's how it came across, and maybe you can clarify that.
Is that what I said?
Can I tell you what you said?
Yeah, because I don't believe that's what I said.
More or less, you came in and you asked for a brief capsule of what happened during Brown,
Right.
and I think Richard was one, and there was someone else who gave you the capsules, and then you started by saying something to the effect that you disagreed mostly with Sandy Lowe's thesis about the Holocaust roots being in the New Testament, because if it was there, how come it didn't happen? The Holocaust didn't happen in 1900 years.
It's not that they kicked them out, but rather that it took 1900.
I think that's what Dr. Harris was trying to get across last week, is that you cannot point at the Bible and say the New Testament is responsible for the genocide of the Jews solely. You can say that the Industrial Revolution contributed to it. You can say that Christianity contributed to it. You can say that German militarism contributed to it. That resources is a real important point that nobody's brought up. When you have groups like you were talking about,
May I?
Yeah, sure.
The New Testament does not call literally for genocide of the Philistines or the Egyptians, but it calls literally for genocide. It says, go kill them. And it talks about the Jews. Not the Serbians, not the Yugoslavs, but the Jews. So that's why I'm saying when Stryker came and said, that I didn't invent it, the text is there.
And I have no doubt that once the culture made, or once the representatives of the culture made the decision that Nazi Germany would exterminate the Jewish race, that Christianity was an effective part of the total propaganda available to them and utilized by them in carrying out the program. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. But there are contrary strains in Christianity, as there are in all religions. And we do know that there was a Christian antipathy to National Socialism, as well as Christian collaboration and participation in National Socialism. I mean, you can read those books a lot of different ways.
but I think that I agree with Sandy Lowe's, the particular excerpts from the Bible that he used, from the New Testament, are real clear cut.
They're
They say, get them out of here, do something about it. But a point I think that needs to be made is that that's not the only reason for the Holocaust. And I think Sandy Lowe relies on that as an explanation primarily. I mean, that's what I got from Sandy Lowe's lecture was, whoa, wait a minute, as a Christian, being raised as a Christian, am I in part responsible for that? I mean, because it comes heavily on anyone who has any kind of a Christian background, I think. And I sit back and think about it, and I wish he'd come back the following week, because it would have, I think there was a lot of discussion that needed to be dealt with, and also it was something he needed to synthesize. It wasn't something he could, or personally I couldn't respond to immediately, because listening to him and singing, and I walked away with thinking that Christianity was to blame. But then I gave it more thought, and I don't think that it's to blame primarily, and that's my only.
I was gonna keep quiet since I'm supposed to be doing this stuff here, but I am in the class, and this is something else, and
Not a little louder.
okay. I very much feel that Christianity is very much about, and don't encounter many. I'm not saying I have not encountered any. But it isn't that simple to look for someone who's done something that they put themselves at risk or whatever. And that's an important thing. Who are you associated with? What organization are you a member of Is the Pope speaking for you? Are you putting money into the organization that supports his point of view? In other words, is he speaking for you? It's almost as simple as, here's what I do, and this is a political statement, so nothing to do with the Holocaust, but I don't eat meat. And I'll tell you why I don't eat it, because it's a political statement. Because if I keep buying meat and I know what the horrible things they do to these animals, I support the system. And that's what he's talking about, Sandy Lowe. And that is, there's much violence that is very subtly taught in Christianity. I'm not saying exclusively Christianity. Some Judaism's got that too, and that's where it got it from. Expanded on it. Okay? But, you know, if I'm a member of a Christian church, and the Pope or someone else, and they preach anti-Semitism, therefore I am part of the problem.
I think the issue boils down to the, at least in the discussions I've heard so far, especially Sandy Lowe's, you're missing really the gospel of Jesus, which was a totally pacifist gospel.
I know that.
The fact that we should love God with all our heart. Second only to that is to love our brother as ourselves. Anyone through time, through history, that can and has and will continue to misuse this. For instance, Jim Jones and the terrible suicides that took place. There's never an excuse for ignoring the true gospel, though. I think that should be pointed out. Nazis were very evil.
I know it's there about what Jesus says. Yes, of course, I know that. I know the gospel of Jesus, and many people know it, but the bottom action, I watch what people say and what they do. You know, it's fine to say it. And if a corporation existed for 2,000 years, that love and peace, and it's still going on when that has not come to fruition, well, give us a few more 100 years, and then maybe we will change.
I would contend, though, it is one of the
well,
essential
organization we
ways.
support is important.
It is the tie to creation, though. If you're a Buddhist, fine. If you're a Semite, fine. I
The
accept
tide
you.
of creation.
Creation is creation. There's
Yeah,
one spirit.
That's a cop-out.
I think it's
Believe.
Yes,
There's
of
one
course,
spirit.
of course.
Hitler was not basically drawing from any Christian organization. He was setting up his own, basically intrinsically anti-Christian organization. He feared the power of the organized churches. He wanted at best a kind of Aryan pseudo-Christianity, and I see this as a perversion of at least the traditional Christianities as they've developed. And if we look at where there was more Christian-rooted anti-fascism in Hungary and Romania, maybe in Spain to some degree, these are not going to the secular extremes, if you will, that Adolf Hitler took the Nazi Party. And it seems to me that where the push more toward a complete genocide occurs in a release from the Christian context far more radically than you find in these kind of half-baked semi-Christian fascist groups in Romania and Hungary that follow the leader more than anything.
That's a good point.
I'd just like to say with that, the Nazis used the Bible. They did use the Bible or misuse the Bible or however you want to say it. But I think it was really more Adolf Hitler's personal hatred for the Jews more than anything else. I think the Bible was just a tool for him to carry out what he wanted to carry out. He had hatred for the Jews all of his life, ever since he lived in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that should be the point also. And it's
But
not
it
just
played
Christianity,
well.
it's Adolf Hitler.
But it played well, come on. But
He used it. He
a
used
lot
it.
of people seem to have this personal hatred for the Jews. It wasn't just him and his mania. That underestimates all of the other people around him who shared that.
That's true,
sentiment.
but I'm saying we can't blame just Christianity. We have to look at the person who guided the Führer.
It also
leader
doesn't explain
principle.
the annihilation of gypsies. How do you explain that?
You
It was
also
Hitler's own
don't
hatred for
blame
these
you don't
people.
blame Christianity because Hitler warps it, any more than you blame Wagner because he warps Wagner, or all the other things he warped. Darwin, I know.
I do agree that Christianity was a very useful tool because it said clear cut. It spelled out a hatred that had existed, maybe subliminally in a lot of cases, but that hatred, tried to pretend that hatred just was surfaced in 1940. It was in the Bible, it was written there, and it was evident throughout Western Europe.
It's not only there, it's endemic in the books, and it's necessary to the faith.
Yeah, the faith couldn't have,
You know,
and Sandy Loper, I think, showed that very well. He showed how it was necessary for the survival of the church.
We've got some new speakers.
It seems to me that we're not emphasizing the context in which all these things occur. What comes to mind is the Nazi attempted rally in Santa Rosa not too long ago, a few years ago, and they met with wherever they met with because of the context that it's in. Now, if they had done the same thing in Nazi Germany, we would have had a different result. So, to me, it seems that the social structures that are in Supreme Court. So these are the things to me that control. It's the idea in the public's mind of what public opinion is. So I said it was the idea of what people think public opinion is that controls what the structures do and mean. And I don't think we've even begun to touch on that particular point. To me, that's the whole controlling issue.
I'd like to recommend to the group here a book that's in the library. I happen to donate the book. About 2 years ago, 2 to 3 years ago, there was an exhibition down at the Jewish Museum in San Francisco from West Germany, put on by a West German historian about the history of Jews in Germany from the Middle Ages or on maybe or before. If there's any doubt in if you read that book, if there's any doubt in anybody's mind that there was a basic religiously motivated anti-Semitism, I mean, you want to see a Jew drawn and quartered? There's a nice picture in that book. You want to see a Jew burnt at the stake? There's a nice picture in that book. These were great big panels as big as this wall that they reduced down into this book. It's a picture book. All historical facts, time, dates, places, and so forth and so on. The Germans, so Hitler created another edict against the Jews. They lived with edicts against the Jews and supported edicts against the Jews for hundreds of years. It's all there. So, you know, it's there. The record is there.
I think
the title.
That's basically the title. I've even forgotten the exact title. It's the history Jews of Germany. It's a big square book. Full of pictures. The pictures from the museum. That's what it is.
I think a lot of us are saying the same thing. I think we're saying that Christianity fit really well into Hitler's scheme of things. And Goebbels, is he the one that was the propaganda? He saw it as, you know, a real effective propaganda tool, and he took it to the limit. Like you said, all the posters and stuff like that. But to look at that exclusively excludes the necessary incorporation of all these other variables and the fact that it wasn't only Jews who were killed.
I mean, did Hitler and Goebbels attend church regularly on Sundays?
Well, the interesting thing is, if I some few things, both were raised Catholics, which is Himmler was a Catholic. Hitler was a Catholic, and Hitler did not leave the church, although he was not a practicing Catholic. In several accounts, he has made very clear his hatred for priests. Now, the interesting thing, in spite of the fact that Goebbels, Himmler, Bormann, always, they totally dissociated themselves from the Catholic Church. Not only that, but wanted to invade the Vatican and remove the Pope. So the second step for them to do after they would have successfully eradicated the Jews were indeed the Christians. Christianity was done away with. There's absolutely no question about that. There are plenty of records. I wrote it in my book, in several other accounts which I published. No question about that. The second thing, which I think is exceedingly important, is that they were in a stage to develop their own religion, which was the religion of the believers, so-called believers in God, God-gläubig. It was the new religion, and first practiced primarily in the upper circles, the leadership circles. Bormann belonged to it. They all left the church. Hitler did not, which is a very interesting thing. They left the church and started their own church, and Himmler was one of the major instigators of that. And they had particular centers not familiar with it because it simply had not developed sufficiently in order to do away with the Vatican and install the new creed, particularly to begin with, in the elite, the German elite, the pure Aryans, and they were basically the members of the SS to begin with, and the high Nazi circles. That's where it really started. And that is a very interesting thing, reflected already in the discussion, Himmler's discussion with a man called Rauschning, Hermann Rauschning, interview with Hitler. There's a questionable authenticity, what actually has been said and all that, as in all interviews which are not taped, right? Because you have to rely on memory, and at times you simply cannot take notes. But Hitler made very clear that he wanted to, that National Socialism to him, to begin with, was more than just an ideology. It was to be a new creed on which to build a new religion, an Aryan, so to speak, an Aryan religion. And these are things which we need to know by looking at the documents, the archives, and doing some in-depth research, otherwise we would know it. Because it is not generally known. It is not much written about, but that doesn't make it less of a fact. Yes?
And the swastika was the symbol of that religion.
That's right.
It was, I mean, the swastika was taken from that basic religion as a symbol of their religion.
A reflection of it, that's right. That's exactly. In order to perhaps help us to go to the nitty-gritty, I've just developed a chart, recently, which I think might help us. What is at the bottom of some of the problems we are discussing, regardless whether it's the Jewish genocide or something else, is what I've tried to reflect on in what I call a devaluation process of ethnic, racial, and religious entities of persons. Before you go any further, we all are influenced by an ideology, by a belief or myth system, which is, for all practical purposes, our mental blueprint behavior. An ideology, of course, is a belief or myth system. It is not something which is based on facts and evidence. It is something we'd like to believe. It's something which we would like to see in the future. It's something which we hope for. It also provides you with a worldview, a perspective, a worldview, by that very nature that it is a perspective, a particular perspective. It is limiting our view, and therefore by that very fact it is a bias. It is a bias. And this bias is of course reflected in how people interact with each other and how they view and how they stress values, how they create social norms, and indeed how they attach meaning to symbols. So, in essence, ideology is just like glasses with which to see the world, which is a distorted view, a biased view of the world. Now, that is something which we all have, except some ideologies differ from another ideology, depending how militant, how doctrinaire, how dogmatic they are. And some are less and some are more. We are talking about Christianity, obviously. There is a dogma, and they talk about a dogma very openly. We talk about Jewish religion, there is a dogma, and that certainly is telling us about realities in a very specific way, which indeed also is a biased view. Any religion provides a biased view. Any politician provides a biased view because they all claim to be the ones who have the truth. Now the question is, do they have it? Or do they want to believe that they have it? And that, depending how militant this ideology is, will then be reflected in the blueprint of behavior, how they will deal with those who do not happen to identify with that particular belief. So therefore, those who do not identify will be dealt with in one way or another. And in National Socialism, it was, of course, from the very moment they assumed power, a very clear-cut picture. So the second step under number 1 is identification and derogation of potential outgroups. So in order to feel superior, I have to group which will be inferior to me, because then without that I would not be in a position to feel superior. Now, the more insecure a group is or an individual is, the more they will be attracted to organizations which will claim that rather than being inferior, they are, for all practical purposes, superior. And that's exactly what National Socialism claimed, as you know, because the world was divided in two types, two types. The Aryans, who were the superior ones, and the non-Aryans. And the most removed from the Aryans were indeed the Jews and later on the Gypsies. But to begin with, the Gypsies were not in the picture at all. The early National Socialism. They only were included later on during World War II. Many Gypsies served in German armed forces and were taken out of it and sent to death camps. Now, so in order, and that's what Hitler said very clearly, he was very clear in saying, if we would not have Jews, he said that to Hermann Rauschning in his conversation with Hitler, by Hermann Rauschning, said to him, supposedly, if we would not have any Jews, we would have to invent them. Why? Because if you don't have a scapegoat, you cannot develop a cohesive elite in-group. All right, so the next step under 101 is prejudice and stereotyping. Exactly, that's what took place. Stereotype prejudice, which was used, the traditional prejudice was used, and Christianity, of course, was a very handy tool to do that. And they used that as a basis, not because they identified with Christianity. How could they? Because Jesus Christ, under any sort of law, was not an Aryan. Let's face it. So they did not identify, although they used it as long as it was useful to them, only to discard it after they no longer needed it. So that is the next step. Any ideology which claims to be the truth will identify those who do not have it and are very accepted. So obviously with any prejudice and stereotyping, we will have a devaluation and derogation of those who have prejudice and stereotype, a dehumanization of those who are defined as not members of the in-group. Oh, as it happened with National Socialism, they came into power. That means they had the power to cast members, defined members of the outgroup into roles. And that is a very important concept. Because if I don't have a power to cast you into a role, you will behave the way you do. But I have the power to define the role for you and force you to play the role as I see you. You will play it. And that's exactly what happened. And when you read and study the Streicher's Stürmer, you'll find very clearly that in some of the letters to the editor, it was said, well, where they could not watch, where they indeed became like animals. And they said, you see, we've told you so. That's who they really are. So you see the logicity and the vicious circle in this sort of situation. By virtue of the fact that those people with a certain ideological view and the prejudices, the biases they have, militant, particularly militant, in which they use violence and force, can cast people whom they identified as whatever they want to identify. They will force them to play the role which indeed has been developed in their ideology, in their blueprint of behavior. And that's exactly what happened. Now when we go to number 2, indeed, when member outgroup are cast into roles, that's what we call, when you act upon an ideology, you talk about a reification of ideological precepts, which in this case created a social distance. And the interesting thing is that regardless of ideology, a social distance will be created between those who are the believers in that particular ideology and who are not a believer. There is always going to be a social distance. The ones who are better, not only better, but they're also distant from me. Therefore, the more distant a person becomes, or a group of people becomes, as you will look at the circle, the out-group and the in-group, the further apart those who are expelled from the body society become, the less people, that's the greater the social distance is, the less people will relate to them and identify with them, empathize with them. Because if you, how do we care what is happening in Afghanistan or in those various countries we've never heard about? I'm exaggerating on purpose. We are not losing a night's sleep over that. Why? Because of the political, ethnical, and geographic distance, you name it. But this also can be accomplished as we have accomplished with those people whom we've expelled from the type of in-group, the Indians, the slaves, and other ones who don't count as much as the WASPs. Now that is changing, to be sure, in our society, but you happen to that, about their fate. And that's exactly what happened in Germany. And it's exactly what happens in any situation in which you have a group of people who consider themselves to be the right ones, the righteous ones, and those who are not. And they will be treated accordingly, and the further they are able to create a social distance between themselves and them, the less they will be concerned about how they will be treated, whether they survive or not. Let me stop here for a moment before I finalize that and see if there are any questions, whether I have lost you or whether you're still with me.
Yeah, I had a comment. You're saying in essence then that the methodology of extermination, for instance, became really probably a decision-making event of those in control within the in-group.
Sure, it was not
got together and said, this is how we will handle it.
That's right.
And then the orders were carried out.
Absolutely so. And that is a historical fact.
Because I remember my cousin who, we had left before, but my cousin who went through some of the things, he said after that, young Jewish fellow, I guess he was Polish background, or his parents were Polish, attacked the attaché in Paris, and they took all the Jews from the age of 16, all males, from the age of 16 to 60. And they put them all in cattle, very nice to us and helped us. They told us then the next chapter after we had left, and they said they had heard that this was going on, and they were outraged. And of course they had no way to handle this. And they knew if the populace would get wind of this and some of the indignity of this would come out, that they were, you know, they had no leg to stand on. So what they then came up with a final solution. They promised this garbage about taking the old people to some lovely land, which is what they promised to my grandmother, and somewhere in the country where they would be taken care of. And this is when my grandmother went, how my grandmother went to Auschwitz.
Well, of course, she didn't have much of a choice.
Well, yeah, but I mean, no, she was said, my grandfather hung himself at Theresienstadt. He was 89 years old. My grandmother said, no, I want to see the children once more.
All right, so what I'm trying to say here is that indeed, regardless of the ideology, if you have this process taking place, if the ideology is indeed militant, intolerant, dogmatic, and so forth, then the are that a discrimination which starts at one point will escalate in violence. Violence will escalate. And the methodology pretty much remains the same regardless of who is involved, people are involved, provided they use this type of ideology which is militant, intolerant, and dogmatic. So the point 3 is degree of ideological identification and concern and compassion with outgroup members as measured by social distance. And from the type of research which is being done at Humboldt State, studying the rescuers, those who have rescued and supported those who were persecuted, we are trying to find out to what extent indeed the social distance between the persecuted and those who were the rescuer, to what extent the social distance was non-existent, because if it had been existent, the chances are they never would have concern and compassion for them. Therefore, we can assume that there was no social distance created by an ideology which the rescuers, those people who supported and assisted the persecuted, did not have, because otherwise they would have not done it. If at all they had an ideology which was supportive of and persecuting, without the other members of society being dreadfully concerned about what happened, what would happen to them. Now the fourth step is discrimination, aggression and escalation of violence directed against outgroups, in extreme cases extermination and genocide. And that's exactly the escalation of the situation. When was indeed genocide developed? First of all, it was already in the blueprint, Hitler's blueprint in Mein Kampf, where he was very clear-cut about the fact where he suggested that the Jews during World War I fighting on behalf of Germany should have been sent to the forefront, and you know that poison gas was used during World War I between the Germans and the French. They were the ones who should have been recipients of the French gas and hopefully that way eliminated. That's already very clearly said by Hitler in Mein Kampf. So therefore we already have a ideological blueprint in Mein Kampf, which then was reified when Jews no longer were able to leave or could be expelled because of of World War II. They couldn't get out anymore. And for that very reason, the ideological conflict which was developed had to be resolved somehow, and you had the Wannsee Conference, which determined the destruction of the German Jews to begin with, and the European Jews. But that was already during World War II. My assertion is, from the evidence available, or my conclusion, and therefore assertion is, that had there been not World War II, the extermination of Jews as we know it, or gypsies, would not have taken place. Other solutions would have been found, because without war the situation could have not been covered. It would have been too well known, and people would have paid more attention to what is really happening. During World War II, people were obsessed and preoccupied with saving their own lives, therefore they came first before someone else who already was expelled from society. So that is something which I pursued, and in my interviews with perpetrators, I've tried to determine, did you know anything about it? And they say, yeah, we've heard rumors and we knew that there was genocide and what have you. So I said, well, did you agree with it? Well, I didn't agree with it. I don't think I really have agreed with it, but so why didn't you do something about it? I said, well, I was preoccupied with saving my own life and that life of those of whom I was in charge. And that's a very interesting thing, because that's what we hear, what comes first, or the shirt. And during that particular time, namely wartime, the skin comes even more first, because it's a very unhealthy situation to be in, to begin with. So people obviously are more interested in their own safety than those who are second-class or third-class citizens. All right, so that is something which needs to be understood. And the fifth step here is cognitive dissonance. You justify that, reduction of cognitive dissonance based on ideological and emotional grounds. So when people have said, well, they had all explanations why they were not that fully concerned as to what happened to the Jews, to the gypsies, and other people who were not viewed as favored citizens, and they justified it on ideological grounds. And I remember one discussion, a person who was privy to all what we are discussing here, who was a high member of the high officer in the SS, and said, we felt the concentration camps and the people who were sent there were totally justified, and that they should be dealt with was totally justified when we consider that the best, the elite, bled to death on the battlefield, on the battleground, and here you have the scum readily accepted and make it more acceptable. And for that we use ideology. So that's what I thought I'll briefly share with you and see how you respond to that, if it makes any sense to you.
I had a question about, weren't Poles viewed with just as much contempt as Jews?
What?
Poles.
Right.
So, they're not Jewish, though. I mean, there's a greater body of people there as well being persecuted, who are not Jewish and who are Christian themselves. I mean, Catholic.
Well, of course, they are not as severely dealt with as the Jews. And not only that, but the Poles collaborated along these lines with the Germans.
Some Poles did, but not all Poles did. Obviously, there were some Poles that were gassed.
That's right.
Just as
No, I'm not saying gassed. I'm saying the Poles collaborated with the Germans on one level, namely to deal with Jews, because they were not particularly more friendly towards them than the Nazis themselves.
But I was also under the impression that there were some Poles thrown into camps as well.
Yes.
There were.
Okay.
Of course there were, but these were there because of political
I
reasons.
see. Anti-fascists.
They were supposed to primarily be workers. A lot of the Eastern European peoples were put in as work, I'm sorry, a lot of the Eastern European people were put into camps as workers or put into work brigades throughout, under the German occupation.
No, he's talking about those who were sent to Auschwitz, yes. For example, I've come into, when I was at Auschwitz-Birkenau, there were plenty of Poles with whom I came into contact. And these were the people who indeed opposed, politically opposed for one reason or another, did certain things which they considered, the Nazis considered, and they are sent to concentration camps. So what he's talking about, labor camps, and that's still a different category. I'm talking about concentration camps where people died. They're not necessarily gassed,
Right.
because Poles were not gassed. Although some Russians, some commissars were gassed also at Auschwitz.
Well, doesn't Hitler also seem to make an association with Jews and communism? And a lot of his earlier, because supposedly
right.
some leaders
He
of
lumped them
communism-
together. He
yeah.
said Bolshevism is Jewish and everything which is communist is led by Jews, and he named some few who indeed were Jews, and therefore lumped that together, and Marxism and all that is Jewish anyway. Marx was a Jew. So indeed, Bolshevism is Jewish
'Cause I think,
conspiracy.
but there did happen to be some leaders of Bolshevik movements in Germany who happened to be Jewish,
That's
which
right.
could even fuel his hatred even
Well,
more.
yeah,
to
well, you always,
associate among-
because you have a selective vision and a selective memory. Once you embrace an ideology, that's precisely the nature of ideology. It gives you a tunnel vision.
I'd just like to add one thing, that it's not so much a historical thing as a conceptual. I think it would be more sensitive to say that when you're talking about the Jews, you're talking about national Jews in each state. We're talking about German Jews and Polish Jews. We're not talking about Jews as if they exist outside of state boundaries. These are citizens of the countries in which they live, for almost all the part. So what you're talking about is part of a country exterminating a part of its own citizenry. I think that's a really important point to understand, even though they have chosen to follow. Most white Americans never saw an Indian throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. The Indians were pushed way beyond the American settlements. The ones in the South who saw blacks, there were large numbers of whites in the South who never saw blacks, or already saw them in very limited context. The German Jews in Germany were indistinguishable for the most part from the rest of the German population. And the cognitive dissonance that raises up in your own mind when you have to rip apart someone who looks like you, acts like you, eats like you, and all of a sudden is now put into a classification of a dog category, produces strange things inside your mind. It really is. It's hard to deal with.
I'd like to just illustrate this point, okay? Because I went to regular school, and I was very good in athletics. I was middle-massive, average in intellectual pursuits. I did not have...
The way those who don't know it, there was the Hitler Youth leader at that particular time.
And I said, "You don't want me." And they said, and he said, "Why not?" I said, "I'm Jewish." And he left.
Well, what Richard was talking about is the Indians also were part of that society which was being established here. So I don't know quite whether I agree with him totally. The Jews in Central Europe were never totally integrated to begin with, even if they behaved and talked and looked like all the other ones. But they were still separate, and this being separate was taken advantage of to the extent that they really could now use the disparity between the real German and the gap which existed between the real German, in quotes, unquote, and the not that real German, namely the Jewish German, was sufficient to really break it out and remove them totally. So I think what Richard meant well, but I don't quite agree with him, because there was not an integration of the German Jews to such an extent that there would have not been a disparity. Disparity existed, even though there were Jews whom we would call as integrated Jews.
So would you say that Christianity was a tool for the in group, or would you say that it was a cause?
Well, the Nazis never identified with the Christian cause to begin with, and that would be a terrible mistake to assume. They opposed it because it stood against what they preached, namely the Aryan superiority. You just simply, Christianity was created by Jews, and the first Jewish followers, the first Christians were Jews. Now this is not an easy thing to and I think we have somehow ignored that little fact here. So therefore I think we need to be very careful before we jump to conclusions, because it was an ideological difference. Well, obviously, the ideological difference was that, very simple, that the Redeemer had come for some Jews. Jesus Christ was accepted as Redeemer, and the other ones who did not accept him.
In one of the lectures.
I didn't say anything because I didn't give a lecture yet. That's my first.
Well, I mean, the idea of sibling rivalry, I think, is a very good term, as far as I'm concerned, between the Christian and Jews in that sense. And it's sort of similar to me as it was between the socialist and the communist. I mean, in Europe, in Germany, as I recall. I mean, maybe because I was raised with Freudian terminology, so I'm speaking more of the concept than actually of the...
As we can see, Freudian analogy has its limits. Any other? Yes?
Who in the Nazi hierarchy was responsible for setting up these camps as a system for annihilation?
Well, that was delegated to Reichsleader, Reichsführer, SS Reichsführer Himmler. And he received, from what is pretty much agreed upon by those who are students of National Socialism, an order from Hitler, not a written order, but just a verbal order, that is to proceed with it. And they organized it and developed that, for which they've had all the necessary technical instruments and organizational instruments. And they did it, as we know, with some sort of team spirit and good organization. There's no question about that. So the SS was primarily in charge of that, but they also used other institutions. For example, the Ministry of Transportation had to be involved because people had to be moved from one place to another. So indeed, there was an interrelationship, but the responsibility was given to the SS.
I'm assuming there's a particular brainchild to have these camps.
Well, the details, yes, there were the brainchild of those people who had expertise in that sort of field. And then he was replaced by Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who took his place, and he then continued what Heydrich had started. So there was a particular branch in the SS responsible for the camps and the extermination.
It seems too we've gotten away from the racial identification of Jews. The ideological differences may have been used to force the out-group out, but then a line had to be drawn. You were saying how 25% was considered, you know, that's what made you Jew if you had a grandparent that was Jewish. And
well, to be very exact, if 50%, that is to say, one pair of grandparents was Jewish and the offspring was not baptized, you were considered to be Jewish for all practical purposes. If you were baptized, you could get a break and were not sent into concentration camps. Now, the interesting thing is, in my more recent research, I found, for example, that Hitler's dietitian was 25% Jewish. Her grandmother was Jewish, but she was baptized. But when it was discovered, because she wanted to marry an SS officer, and therefore they went into her background more thoroughly, they found that indeed she had a Jewish grandmother. That is to say, she was immediately removed as Hitler's dietitian, but because he liked her, he made an exception and made sure that she would not be persecuted by the authorities. And Hitler was the only one who could make an exception, no one else. That's in the laws, in the books, that Hitler was the only one who could make an exception, who could declare a Jew a non-Jew.
Didn't they have a special ministry for racial purity?
No. Well, I mean that racial...
Check the background.
Well, they've had some ministries which were overlapping, which dealt with these sort of things in general.
Was it generally part of the SS?
To a very large extent, yes. Particularly during the war. Yes.
It always seems funny to me, how did they decide who was Jewish? I mean, did they check into the background?
Oh yes,
all
of course.
these people?
You see, unlike here, and it's still pretty much in place today in Central Europe, everything is registered. The bureaucracy is just fabulous. And that's very important, and I'd like to say something about it. I'm glad you've asked it, because I think it has very important ramifications. If you are and live in some place, so you have to go to the police, today Germany and then Third Reich Germany, and have to tell them where you live. You have to register. And when you go there and unregister and register where you go, so that they can keep tabs on you. Everything is documented, everything is in the book, so therefore it was very easy for people to find out. And then of course part of it is also, the question is, what is your religion?
But there must have been people who didn't practice.
No, you practice, because if you socialize to respond to bureau demands, and if you consider that almost a tradition, and we talked earlier about the Prussian tradition, and you consider that to be proper and reasonable, you do it. Besides, if you don't do it, there is a very high fine, and you don't want to pay that. Your own will be caught, because there is a high fine, still is a high fine, and then it was an even higher one. So therefore you comply, and therefore it was very easy for people to round up. You know, everything was registered. If you were Jewish, you were registered in the Jewish what?
Column.
Well, in the synagogue and the Jewish community, you were registered there as a Jew. Everyone was. Or you were baptized, and you were registered in where you were registered. It was all official. It is all on paper. And therefore it was easy to do, and that went back to the 15th century, if need be. And these sort of books were considered to be almost sacred. You know, that is not going to be destroyed. So people saved it, even if there were some upheavals and all that. These things were saved. These were preserved. And therefore they had records. And these records they used to determine who is who. And they did. And they did research, and particular institutions which developed expertise in finding out your background. Now, therefore, it is a very important thing, particularly in dictatorships, that all the records should be destroyed, you know, in time, before there is a dictatorship installed, because that may save your life. And in a way, here it'd be very difficult to persecute people, because we don't even know if someone is...
After Berlin was bombed, they were born and raised in Berlin, and after Berlin was bombed, they were living in the country somewhere. They suddenly went back and said they were not Jewish, and that they that their records were destroyed, and his friend happened to have a lame leg from arthritis or something like that, and he said this was a war injury, and that's why he was not in the service. And they developed, they sent to themselves, and that way identified themselves, and created a whole new world. And it was really interesting afterwards because they came over here and I saw them again. And she got to the point, she said, she at this point can't ever tell when she's telling the truth or not because she got in so many stories and so many things that she had to sort of pretend. And it became very difficult later on to live a real life.
In my line of work, I have occasion to look at people's credit. And through the computerized credit reporting systems in this country, I can find out an awful lot about people. I don't find out their race or religion, but I can find out in some cases marital status, where they live, where they work. I can get a pretty comprehensive profile just from the way things are now. Wouldn't it to increase that system? Even on this Iran-Contra thing, I read within the last several weeks that some memos were electronically sent from one White House staff member to the other. Each person then tore up their copies, didn't know that the computer was storing the message electronically somewhere, and it is these messages
Could be
have been retrieved.
Well, it's something very important to remember, just in case.
Professor Stein.
In the book Search for Mimi,
Yes.
he talks about originally the distinction between the labor camps and the like Auschwitz.
Mhm.
He talks about them almost like they're at the same place. I'm a little confused about that.
Well, you see, because let's say Auschwitz had satellite camps, and some of the satellite camps, that is to say, many of these satellite camps were slave labor camps. Now, that does mean that these people no longer could work in these slave labor camps, that the conditions were much better. Yes, to some extent they're better, and some of the things will be discussed perhaps when some of us survivors will talk about how we survived and whatever. But if people in slave labor camps, inmates in slave labor camps became disabled so that they were really seriously ill, they were sent to the main camp to be killed. So you have to understand that many, like let's say Dachau, but they developed particularly when there was a great loss of people because of war fatalities.
So did they develop later in the war? That's
Yeah,
beginning
because until that time, let's say 43, people who were, for instance, Jews, were gassed. But then when there was a very acute shortage, then they were sent, ours, for example, Auschwitz-Birkenau, when an order came that all the able-bodied, which was a laugh, you know, but I mean, that's all a very relative term, were sent to, were selected by Mengele and some other doctors. He was by no means the only SS doctor there. And sent to slave labor camps, which were established. And instead of being gassed, which was the original purpose, they were more needed to die while producing some useful work. And that's exactly what happened. I was selected and sent to a place which was a what we would call synfuel industry, synfuel, synthetic fuel, and was not gas. Well, otherwise, the chances are, as some of my other relatives were gassed. But that only happened after 43 and later. Until that time, people primarily were sent to be destroyed. To destruction, that's why we call it destruction camps, yes.
To get back to the statement you made before, if Hitler did, if we didn't have the Jews, we'd have to invent them. It seems to me either to be logically irrational or maybe rationally illogical in terms of Hitler's mindset, because the reason I say that is if his war against the Jews had to have been an enormous expense. Enormous expense. It had to have cost him. And if that's true, then why would Hitler need to have, you know, a people or anybody to do that with that?
Well,
It would be a self-defeating.
the notion is very simple. He said that in connection with, in order to be superior, set myself up as a superior group, I have to find a counter group which will be inferior. And that's exactly what it meant. That's what he meant. That if we would have not the Jews as, we would have to invent them.
I guess maybe that's the term that bothers me, because generally with a scapegoat, the scapegoat seems to have a function.
Oh, yes.
One of the
Oh, yeah, of course.
is being able to transfer hatred and
Right.
distrust and so forth
Very correct.
from the population. But if you kill the scapegoat, then you don't have any scapegoat anymore.
That's very correct. That's very
That was the
correct,
idea.
because the idea was to purify the German nation, left the Slavs. And that is something, they came next. And indeed, the Christian Church, the Vatican, the Pope. So, I mean,
In terms of the scapegoat concept, I think we're kind of overlooking some of Hitler's political roots right after the First World War, when the myth was bandied about Germany that Germany was not raided, but was rather stabbed in the back
Right.
by a variety of different nefarious elements, among whom were the Jews. Hitler played on that very heavily in the beginning of his political career.
but primarily the Jews, not among, but primarily the Jews, yes. But we've said that during the first lecture, that was made very clear.
Yeah, so
Yeah, that's
it's
very correct.
important, particularly at the beginning, you know.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, made them responsible for the loss of the war. Not they were responsible at a kind of reduction of cognitive dissonance by using that ideology and inventing a story about the Jews.
The October criminals.
And the October criminals, which included socialists and communists, who obviously were also non-Jews.
We must always, regard the scapegoat and the killing of the scapegoat. We must always remember what Dr. said before. I mean, the evidence is there. There's no question about it that if National Socialism had its druthers, and if there was no war, the Jews would not have been killed. They would have been expelled.
Well, they would have been killed, but not in these numbers.
Well, yeah, not in numbers. Eichmann, quote, was a Zionist. He had made contacts with the Israelis in Zion to see what could be done about shipping the Jews to, at that time, Palestine.
Or Madagascar.
Or, and then the Madagascar
Right.
plan. That's right. Eichmann actually tried to make a trip to Palestine to meet officials of the Jewish agency there. He got as far as Egypt, the British wouldn't let him in. That's a fact.
That's true.
Yes.
Have there ever been any studies on how much wealth was accumulated by the Nazis from, literally stolen from the Jews, as the ones that left in the early years that had to sell at a fraction of the
Right.
price, and then those
Yes.
that were
Yes,
literally
the question is to what extent these documents still exist or were destroyed. Now, that was there was a man called Dr. Koher, and he was the SS statistician. And they were very specific about what sort of values were removed, were taken from the Jews who were sent to camps and confiscated before and all that. So that was processed through the SS and statistically reflected on paper. And the question is to what extent these are still, because much of the document, of course, burned and destroyed on purpose because they didn't want to leave any traces. And I have not seen, which does mean that they don't exist, I have not seen, in my research, I haven't seen any documentation along these lines, other than very general figures put out by some other ministries and agencies. But there is no question that they exist, or should be listed if they were destroyed.
Could that have been a motivation on the part of Nazis, that some wealth was owned by the Jews, and that, you know, by expelling them, you
Oh
confiscated.
yes, yeah. Well, they were very interested in that because the Nazi hierarchy improved their lot by taking what they felt they wanted to take. And yes, indeed, there was certainly a motive.
Last year I was in Switzerland and my friends were Mennonite, came from Mennonite missionary families. And they I'd never heard this before, and they said that it was well known among the Mennonites that Hitler, in order to keep his government from being bankrupt, started some of these things and took the wealth of the Jews. That was the only thing that saved them. Now, I don't know, I had before, but it was an interesting...
Well, I'm not an economist, I think, so I'm not qualified to talk about that because I don't have enough knowledge along these lines. But certainly it made quite a bit of difference. But in the long run, I think it was a loss. I think it was a bad business in the long run.
There's someone here that's been wanting to...
Right.
Your evaluation process here, and I didn't hear it being talked about in the dehumanizing the people that went on, was calling the Jews a diseased people, the germ warfare that was going on in there by quarantine, and the initial quarantining of people, removing them from society by expulsion or then into the camps. It was more of a quarantine kind of action, similar to what we did with the Japanese here in California.
Genetic criminals. And from that very reason, that was the reasoning in legal definition and so forth, that was the reason that indeed they behaved not because they're socialized to behave in a certain way, but they couldn't help themselves. They were genetically inferior and therefore behaving in a way which was posited on biophysiological reasons rather than, and that's why they also viewed the religion as a product of their genetic background rather than a religion.
And so the quarantine is a tactic that is used for this process of devaluating a people or groups of people,
Well,
such as
removal, that is to say removal from the social body.
I wanted to bring that up in reference to current issues.
Right.
Of quarantining people with AIDS or quarantining
Right.
people suspicious of that.
Right. We put them into camps, we separate them and isolate them.
Was there actual government definitions of what constituted a Jew and how they should be related to, like, you know, to be written in Mein Kampf, like you say, or genetic criminals? I mean, where
A
would a German
race
citizen
of
get this
criminals.
information?
I beg your pardon?
Where would, say, a German citizen at that time get this information?
This information, it was propagated and it was to be found in many books. It was written all over the place. And in dailies, in journals, whatever, you know, I mean, it was...
It was a constant propaganda.
Yes, absolutely, sure, of course, yeah. And it was reiterated by this in the speeches of the Nazi leaders, especially Hitler, Goebbels, who were the major speakers. And
Lots of agencies of the government,
Yes,
social...
yes.
Speakers all over town. Some of these people right now.
well, you see, the interesting thing is that so many people didn't quite take it seriously. Some people indeed viewed it as propaganda until the time it was acted upon. And then they said, well, I can't risk any interference, and as I keep on saying, that no one knew anything about concentration camps and what happened in them, but everyone was afraid to get into one. And the interesting thing is, which during my last class last semester on the sociology of the Holocaust, we've had a speaker who was a person of 50 years old, and he was a kid during the end of the war. He was a young kid, and his parents kept on telling him, if he misbehaved, if you don't behave, we'll send you to Dachau. So indeed, people knew that these camps existed, and they also knew who was going to be sent there. people who simply deviate from what is considered to be an acceptable norm in National Socialist Germany.
So actually,
Easy to understand.
Was there not actual law passed defining what a Jew is?
Mm-hmm.
That was what, law Nuremberg?
Oh yeah, sure.
So it was like a-
Nuremberg laws, yeah.
Nuremberg law, so it wasn't just speakers randomly.
No, I mean that was,
Highly organized.
oh yes, that was legally defined and kind of ridiculous, but legally defined and could be implemented.
I still have a hard time with the racial definition that
Yeah.
Hitler used. Did people, like you said, your friends who were able to create a new life for themselves, but they had to obliterate their entire past to do that. Were there people that were 25% or 50% Jewish who were baptized? Were they able to continue their lives on a regular course, or were they ostracized in the small community?
Well, to some extent, because they were not able to perform certain responsibility or get into certain occupations. And some were even sent to some type of labor camps. But by and large, there was a tremendous difference the way they were treated from those who were considered to be full Jews. So yes, so there are less. For example, ones who were the most meticulous were members of the SS, and they went back to 1760 to have to prove that indeed they didn't have any. And that is a big, very, very extensive correspondence between Himmler and some of the SS leaders. They found that some of the SS leaders, generals, including Heydrich, by the way, had some Jewish ancestry, and therefore they were given the order that their kings were not to marry any other SS person, although their father may have been an SS general. But while he was already SS general, they found out that he was not quite pure, and that it was too late, so they couldn't very well demote them and all that. That would have created some sort of disturbance there, which they didn't want. So then they ordered that particular parent, this particular SS general, that his children to marry an SS member.
Okay, take an example of the grandparents of practicing religious Jews, and they Orthodox, say, and the grandchildren live, maybe they wouldn't live in the same area of town, but it seems like it would be hard to draw that line just because they had been baptized.
Well, but that was not, well, but you see that if 50%, if one,
Yeah, or one parent.
one of, that is one couple of, one pair of grandparents was non-Jewish, and the other one was Jewish, and you were not baptized, they didn't help you any. You were sent to a camp. You were viewed as a Jew. If you were baptized, which is, again, this sort of illogicity, but yet, you know, can be enforced, you were not viewed as a Jew. And there was a distinction between first-grade Jew and second-grade Jew. No.
I remember another incident, Helene Meyer, I don't know whether you heard it, because I was in sports, I didn't know what it was. She was allowed, she was half Jewish, and but she was very blonde and very, still non-Jewish looking. And Hitler agreed that she could represent the Germans in 6 Olympics. And she was half Jewish. I mean, one parent was...
But she was baptized, I'm sure.
I think she was baptized.
Right.
But Gretel Bergmann, who would have won the high jumping contest, who was Jewish and dark and all that, she was not allowed to. She would have gotten the medal for Germany that year.
Any other questions? Or should we, yeah.
Yeah, I'm hearing lots of discussion of intermarriage. Was this far more common in Germany than other?
It was very common. I don't know whether it was more common, but it was very common. I don't know, I can't say whether it was more common, but it was very common, yes.
Because I know that it seems within America, the first Jews that came to America were German Jews. And they assimilated very well in the population in the earlier days. So it seems to me that there's some kind of thing going on in Germany where they're able to assimilate better. And
in some of the other countries, the Jews were forced to live in ghettos, and consequently they didn't meet it many other people.
Right.
Whereas in Germany, you, at that time, you
That's
could
right.
live anywhere.
I think that's a very good point. All right?